Ever caught yourself thinking that the world revolves around you? That's not just vanity talking. It's a common mental shortcut that our brains use to process information, known as egocentric bias. This cognitive bias makes us the stars of our own stories, the central figures in our own narratives. We see the world through our own set of eyes, and so we naturally give more weight to our own experiences and perspectives. When we try to understand events, concepts, or even other people's behavior, we often fall back on our own point of view as a reference point. But here's the catch. Our perspective isn't the only one. We're not the only actors on the stage. The world is a vast and complex place, teeming with different experiences and viewpoints. So it turns out we're all a little self-centered. But let's dig a bit deeper. Now you might be wondering, how does this egocentric bias actually work? Egocentric bias is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that has been studied for decades. It's the idea that we, as individuals, tend to overestimate our own importance and influence in events, while underestimating the role of others and the environment. It's like we're each in our own little movie, with ourselves as the star and everyone else as supporting characters. This bias affects our perception of the world and can give rise to some interesting behaviors. For instance, have you noticed how when you're driving, all the other drivers are either too slow or too reckless? That's egocentric bias in action. We focus so much on our own driving, our own schedule, our own needs, that we forget other drivers have their own perspectives and reasons for their behaviors. Or consider the classic example of a group project. Often people perceive that they've done more work than their partners. This perception isn't always accurate, but it's a result of egocentric bias. We're more aware of our own efforts and contributions and less aware of those made by others. Another interesting manifestation of egocentric bias is the false consensus effect. This is when we overestimate how much other people agree with us. We assume that our beliefs, thoughts, and actions are more common and acceptable than they actually are. This is why you might be surprised when someone disagrees with your obviously correct opinion. And finally, there's the self-serving bias. This is when we attribute our successes to our own skills and efforts, and our failures to external factors. So if you ace a test, it's because you're smart and studied hard. But if you fail, it's because the questions were unfair or the room was too noisy. Clearly, egocentric bias can color our world in fascinating ways, but what are the implications? Just imagine how different the world would be if we were all perfectly objective observers. That's quite a thought, isn't it? But alas, we are not perfectly objective. Our perspectives are colored by our egocentric bias, and this bias has far-reaching consequences. Let's start with interpersonal relationships. When we interact with others, we naturally assume that they see the world as we do, that they share our perspectives, our values, our beliefs. This is the egocentric bias at work. However, when we discover that their views differ from ours, we may feel shocked or betrayed. Misunderstandings arise, conflicts flare up. The harmony of our relationships is disrupted. It's like trying to listen to a symphony with earplugs in. We hear only a muffled version of the music, not the full, rich sound. In the same way, egocentric bias prevents us from truly understanding others. We hear only what our bias allows us to hear, not the full, rich complexity of their thoughts and feelings. Now let's consider decision-making. When we make decisions, we naturally believe that our choices are the best ones. After all, we wouldn't make a decision that we thought was wrong, would we? But this is the egocentric bias speaking. It convinces us that our viewpoint is the only correct one, that our decisions are the best ones. But what if they're not? What if our decisions are flawed? Not because we're unintelligent or careless, but because our egocentric bias has blinded us to other possibilities. We may end up making poor decisions that have serious consequences for ourselves and others. So, you see, egocentric bias is not just a psychological curiosity. It's a powerful force that shapes our relationships and our decisions, sometimes with devastating effects. It seems that egocentric bias is not just a quirk of human cognition, but a force that shapes our lives in significant ways. But wait a minute, if we're all prone to egocentric bias, is there any hope for us? Well, let's not surrender to despair just yet. Like any obstacle in life, egocentric bias can be tackled and overcome. How, you might ask? It's a multi-step process that involves self-awareness, perspective-taking, and a willingness to question our own beliefs and assumptions. Firstly, we need to recognize that egocentric bias exists within us. It's a natural part of being human. So don't think of it as a personal failing, but rather as a universal human tendency. Once we become aware of this bias, we can start to take action against it. This brings us to the second step, actively seeking out other perspectives. This might involve reading books from authors with different backgrounds, engaging with people who have different points of view, or even just listening to a podcast that challenges your assumptions. The key here is to expose ourselves to a variety of perspectives, to broaden our understanding of the world. And this isn't just about taking in new information. It's about really trying to understand where other people are coming from. This is the essence of empathy, stepping into another person's shoes and trying to see the world through their eyes. The third step is to question our own beliefs and assumptions. This can be a difficult process, as it often means confronting uncomfortable truths. But remember, growth often comes from discomfort. If we're willing to question our own views, we open the door to new insights and understandings. Finally, it's important to remember that overcoming egocentric bias isn't a one-time thing. It's a continuous process that requires ongoing effort. We need to constantly remind ourselves to step outside our own experiences, to seek out different viewpoints, and to question our own assumptions. Yes, overcoming egocentric bias is a challenge, but it is a challenge well worth taking on. Because in doing so, we not only become more understanding and empathetic individuals, but we also contribute to a more inclusive and understanding society. And isn't that a goal worth striving for? So, there you have it, a deep dive into the world of egocentric bias. We've journeyed into the realm of self-centered perception, examining this psychological phenomenon that subtly yet profoundly affects our everyday lives. We've dissected its mechanics, shedding light on how it molds our interpretation of the world. Through our own lens, we often see ourselves as the main characters, forgetting that everyone else has a narrative just as complex as ours. We've also explored its impact. From strained relationships to skewed decision-making, the ripple effects of this bias are far-reaching. But we haven't stopped at merely identifying the problem. We've delved into strategies for overcoming this bias, empowering you with tools to foster a more objective perspective. Remember, the world doesn't revolve around any of us, but with a little effort we can all become more objective observers of it.